Hey everybody, welcome back to Spacecast. I'm Josh, and I'm here with the Director for the Center for Space Standards and Innovation, Dan Oltrogge. Dan, thanks for coming.
Thank you.
And you have a paper that you put together that you are presenting at the NASA Space Debris Conference in December.
Correct.
And that's what you're going to go through today. You're going to give us a little bit of a preview of that paper, and then at the end, you'll tell us when and where it's going to be available?
Yes, you
Great.
bet.
Thanks, Dan. So before you start into the presentation, can you real quickly give a high-level overview of what CSSI does?
Yeah, the Center for Space Standards and Innovation obviously works on space standards, which ties directly to what I'm going to share with you today. And then we also innovate, so we're working on new algorithm development, new applications of old techniques to new problems, just a diverse set of activities and innovation.
Great.
So today I wanted to discuss with you a little bit about space governance. This is kind of a confusing topic, and as we get into the various flavors of it, you'll see why it's so confusing. There's just a lot of different parts at the international and national and governmental organization standpoints, a lot of flavors of this. So as Josh mentioned, we will be putting this content into a paper for the December conference. So let's dig in. I'm going to start by kind of setting the context for why we need space governance and why it's so important. We'll talk about the current space environment and operating in that environment, and then again, we'll get into a broad overview of space governance. We will look a bit specifically at new space. This is the large constellations and very small satellites that we've now entered into the era of. And there is a danger that people may fall asleep. So in my chart here, I have a picture of people sleeping. Space standards and space governance to some is not the most exciting of topics, but it's extremely important. And for lawyers and policymakers, they don't fall asleep. It's very exciting.
Well, they can always play this back at faster than regular speed.
Yes,
so
that might be a good thing. So let's talk a bit about the current space situation. I have a question on my chart about who is Burton Courpellet. Turns out he was a co-author on the very well-known Kessler syndrome paper, but nobody hears his name.
It's too hard to say, probably.
Right, it could be. So these are based on some research we've done in the past using a NASA and an ESA space debris population model. What we found is that if you look at what we're tracking today in LEO, low Earth orbit, you'll find that we're only tracking an estimated 4% of the objects in low Earth orbit. And this goes down to objects of size 1 centimeter. And 1 centimeter is kind of the recognized lethality point. Something above 1 centimeter would kill your satellite. So this is not a really good SSA or space situational awareness level for low Earth orbit. And it turns out that at geosynchronous orbit, it's kind of the same thing. Happens to be the same number of 4%. So we don't have a full awareness of what's up there today, which is pretty interesting and a bit disconcerting.
4%, yeah, that's pretty low.
Yeah, not high. There's also a state of health assessment that the European Space Agency does annually. And they look at launchers, they look at on-orbit vehicles, and fragmentation events that occur. So I've just captured, courtesy of the ESA Space Debris Office, captured some of the content from their study. And there have been 530 fragmentation events occurring, and 246 of those in the last 20 years. So if you do the math here, it's very, very simple. You end up finding 11 and a half non-deliberate fragmentation events happened annually. So that's a pretty high number. And unfortunately, these fragmentation events add a lot of additional debris objects to our space population. And a lot of these fragmentation events, or at least almost a quarter of them, have orbit lifetimes of over half the fragments that exceed 25 years. So these are lasting debris objects. They're going to be there for some time.
Just to pause it right there for a second. Those numbers you just cited, that's not common knowledge, even in the industry.
A lot of times not. No, people think that we're managing the space debris problem, and some of these fragmentation events are dead objects that have not been passivated properly, and their fuel or batteries or something else explodes, or they collide with another object. Now in LEO for payloads, if you're looking at active satellites, if you look at how they're being operated, it can be between 25 and 50% are in a compliant orbit, which means that 75% to 50% are not. And again, these are ESA assessments. Different people may come up with different numbers, but I think it's fairly clear that not all of our space operations today is compliant with the space governance that we do have. And that's why this chart is in here, to say that, yes, we do have some space governance, and we'll be going through that, but even the stuff that we have today is not universally being adopted and used. So that was active satellites. On rocket bodies, it's a better number. We have about 30% is not in compliant orbits in the operation. So there is a trend away from delaying your deorbit to actually intentionally re-entering and getting stuff out of orbit. That's a very positive trend, but still we're not 100% compliant there. There's a bunch more statistics here. For the sake of time, I'm just going to show them to you briefly. But just to say, it depends on whether you're in low Earth orbit or geosynchronous Earth orbit, the level of compliance we have. But again, it's not universal. This is a chart showing spatial density evolution. This happens to be from 2005 to 2015. And what you see is that the spatial density of our objects in low Earth orbit has increased by quite a bit in just 10 years.
What's that red stripe?
That happens to be the Fengyun intercept, the Chinese ASAT test that they did in 2007. You can also see some banding in 2009 when the Iridium-Cosmos collision occurred. When these collision events happen, there's something called nodal regression differential rates. So your orbit plane regresses at different rates depending on your average altitude. And so what you see here is that the red concentration of objects when the fragmentation event happens gradually spreads out. And now in 2015, we kind of have a little stocking cap, if you will, on the Earth of spatial density. I want to make it clear that we're not trying to depict 2015 as a terrible condition. If you look at the color scale here, you'll see that even the highest red value here indicates one object in a 100 by 100 by 100 kilometer box, just one object in there. So red is not the sky is falling. At the same time, you can see that things have increased a lot. Spatial density has increased maybe even up to 100-fold over this 10-year period. So it's definitely a trend that's not too positive. This shows you the evolution of the space population over time since the beginning of our space race, if you will. And you can see the active objects and inactive in green and yellow. Debris is in red. These are the little dots you see flying around. And you can also see the overall trend here in terms of the count of objects that are being tracked. I want to reemphasize, this plot is only for the objects that are being tracked. So again, that may be only 4% down to 1 centimeter of what's actually up there. And you'll see that these numbers get to be in the 20,000 sort of range, which is high, but again, that's maybe only 4% of what's up there. So now finally, let's get into space governance. You've now seen the context of where we're at. We don't have full space situational awareness. We don't have full compliance with space governance. Now, my assertion, having worked at the international and national levels, and also at the standards development levels, is that there really is no universal globally binding space law. There are binding instruments out there, and that includes treaties and standards and regulations. That's when those are actually adopted by the countries and state actors. So we'll get into each one of these types of documents. And again, if those are adopted by the country or organization, then they're binding for that organization that adopted them. But if they're not adopted, then obviously, even though they have normative text, they're not binding. We also have some non-binding documents that are voluntary and aspirational. I'm going to tell you about a couple of those initiatives and why those are very complementary, I think, to the binding instruments. Now, there are a variety of flavors of national regulations for space, and there's two basic flavors. The traditional one is thou shalt do this, thou shalt do that, and it says levels of compliance and mandates what you do. There's a newer way to regulate nationally, the safety case. And the safety case is where the entity that's doing the regulation doesn't try and prescribe a solution. They don't say you need to have three objects doing a certain amount and you have a level of 3. Instead, they say, you tell me why you think you're safe, and then give me all your analysis that supports that, and then I will evaluate that and say, yep, you're safe, or no, you're not. So that's called a safety case. I think that there's a lot of merit to this. There's also something that applies to space governance. This is all background material for you here, but consensus typically is taken to mean that 100% of the parties in the document agree. And there are consensus groups where this is in fact what they do. And if everyone doesn't agree, then you don't have a document. This tends to happen more at the international level, that you require consensus. But there are organizations like in ISO where consensus does not mean unanimity. So there's a 2/3 vote in ISO for space standards. If it wasn't the minimum requirement, it wouldn't be good enough. And sometimes when we have 100% consensus where you're trying to come up with space governance, to get everyone to agree means you have to kind of devolve to a minimum set. And that's a little tricky and a little frustrating actually to organizations that might be able to do better. There's that
all or nothing in your
Yeah, that's right. There's that perspective versus one of my dad's sayings was, if it's worth doing, it's worth overdoing.
That's a good one.
So if you could maybe meet the minimum requirements, but then in areas where you can see you can do better, aspire to do better. And that's kind of at the backdrop of my whole presentation here, is that there are various ways to govern space and to try and be responsible. And I think it's a holistic thing that we need to take, where we do the minimum set, but then we aspire to do better than that.
Space safety shouldn't be run on the lowest common denominator.
Exactly. So what is a binding document, or semi-binding or non-binding? Governments are only binding if they contain normative text. You shall do this, you will do that. And if it says you should, then that becomes aspirational. Guidelines tend to be non-normative. And if you look at the international context of space governance, and we've evolved from treaties over to principles and then to guidelines and best practice, that's evolving away from normative content. We're using more aspirational content. Now I'm going to walk you through a picture of what I think of as the space governance framework. This is kind of the concept that I saw when I was looking across international landscape and commercial and so forth. We could start with the spacecraft operators in the picture here, but in reality, we could start anywhere in this picture and pick up the chain, because this is all, it doesn't start with, this is just a place for me to start, but it doesn't actually start from that. Spacecraft operators have developed best practices, and they share those with the international community. I show the Interagency Debris Coordination Committee, IDC. I show the UN COPUOS, the Committee for the Peaceful Use of Outer Space. I show the ITU, and International Telecommunications Union. And from those best practices, that feeds into the international level. And then the international community comes up with their own guidelines and best practices. There is also the industry associations, which aggregate commercial and other space operators. Also could be government and non-spacecraft operators, but just relevant industry stakeholders for space. And sometimes those industry associations come up with best practices as well. Then you have space standards, international space standards like the ISO level and the Consultative Committee for the Standardization of Data. And those can take inputs from the international community, from the operators, and from industry associations. These all are fed into national regulatory and policy areas, and that's where you can get your national regulations. Those in turn all get fed back to spacecraft operators. They get fed back to the international community to say, here's what our country is doing and here's how it works. So the interesting thing about this whole landscape is, if one group, pick any one of these blocks that I've animated, were to suddenly say, well, I'm going to take the previous regulation and multiply it times 5. That's the new level for compliance. You may have pushback from other areas of this diagram because they say, A, I'm an operator, I can't do that. You're asking me to do the impossible. Or B, the international community doesn't agree to that. So, there's a whole feedback.
A lot of people you got to get on.
Right. So it's what you call a virtuous cycle. Each part of this document feeds on the others and contributes to the others. So that's the basic backdrop of how I'm going to walk through the space governance discussion. I'm going to actually go through this block one at a time here. So now we'd like to kind of give you the overview of where all these documents fit in. This is a diagram which is actually tied to a space traffic management task that I'm chairing within the AIAA to look at the safety of flight, or SOF, best practices across the community. And what I'm showing here is a bunch of attributes or requirements for space safety and long-term sustainability on the down axis here. And then on the columns going across, we have a bunch of different documents. We have treaties, which are binding content shown in green. We have non-binding next, which are guidelines, international guidelines, national regulations, international standards, and industry best practices. And this is a very exciting work we're doing to characterize all these documents, because you can see where the content is and where the specificity is on all these attributes. Put them all together, that's our composite space governance. It's from all these different sources. First group we're going to talk about here is the international community, the IDC, UN COPUOS, and ITU. The United Nations was formed in 1959 for COPUOS. This is, again, the Committee for the Peaceful Use of Outer Space. And it's to basically promote international cooperation in space. There were some treaties that were very quickly rolled out within 4 years here, and this lists them all. There were 5 treaties that were created. 4 of them are really core, and they have a lot of governing principles. And people can find these easily on the web. I have the web address up on the right here. One of them, the Moon Agreement, the 5th document, is basically unratified and unenforced, but that was one of the set of 5. There is a document on that website which says which of the 197 countries in the UN have ratified these treaties. Actually, if you look at the percentages down at the bottom of this chart, they're not universally ratified. If you were to look at which countries that are spacefaring nations have ratified it, then the percentage is much higher. The interesting thing with new space is that as new companies and countries are coming on board, and they can easily get a small satellite, a CubeSat, and become a spacefaring nation, the percentage of now spacefaring nations is dropping. So there may be a good merit to revisiting the utility of these documents and try and get more people on board. The UN COPUOS has had a long-term sustainability activity going. It started in 2009 or 10. That has recently come up with a 21 guideline set, which does long-term sustainability. This is a consensus set of guidelines. So this is good, but I just want to point out at the bottom there, this is a voluntary basis. It's not legally binding. The IDC, as I mentioned, is a good body that's doing a lot of space debris research, and they also have their guidelines. Their purposes are to exchange info on space debris research, facilitate opportunities for cooperation, and then also identify ways to mitigate space debris. They have a framework here. I'm not going to spend time going through the details of this, but just to say they do have guidelines. Here's listing a few of these in these sections in 5. But again, these are non-binding, and they're not really authored in a way that could be stuffed into or referenced to a commercial contract. They're guidelines. You should have a orbit lifetime less than 25 years, for example. But how do you measure that? What are the analytical techniques you use to measure that and assess that? Those are not supplied in the guidelines. So there's some details maybe at the contractual level that need to be added to that. And that's where the international standards we'll get to in a moment come from. The UN also has some guidelines. Their set of guidelines actually started from the IDC guidelines kind of as a framework, and then there was consensus iteration on those. And they have 7 guidelines in there. But again, not legally binding under public international law. The ITU also has some, it's actually just a 1-page set of guidelines, and it's just for geosynchronous orbit. And again, it's not legally binding. So we've gone through now the international community at the consensus kind of level. Now let's look at the international standards that are developed. Those actually draw upon, again, the international inputs from the IDC and UN COPUOS and ITU. Standards give you a reference framework and a common language to facilitate commercial activity and tech transfer. And this is where, again, you can get to something that is contractually suitable. Now, standards are voluntary, so companies or countries that adopt those standards, that becomes binding. So there is hope here. You know, if people say we're going to follow these, then great. Not everybody does, but many are. Now, in space, there's basically 2 subcommittees within the ISO Technical Committee number 20 that deal with space standards. There's Subcommittee 13 that deals with data messages. How do you convey space data? And I list some of the messages here: orbit data, conjunction data, etc. And then the other one is SC14, Subcommittee 14, which standardizes space best practices. And so I list some of those here. In terms of the UN COPUOS long-term sustainability guidelines that they recently adopted in June, consensus, there's a lot of mentions of needing space standards in various areas. And this diagram shows you between SC13, which is the data messages, and SC14, which is the best practices, which of these venues, if you will, have standards that are relevant to long-term sustainability. This numbering nomenclature, by the way, you have to go to the UN COPUOS website and download the long-term sustainability guidelines. It's freely available. If you get the latest numbering scheme, the numbers of the various clauses in that document map to these outer levels here. Next thing is industry associations. So again, we're going through this whole space governance framework. There are a lot of industry associations. They do some very great work, people getting together to try and make things better and represent the industry. And you might say, well, what can the operators and industry associations accomplish? Well, the concept here is one of self-regulation, that they would have to, of course, adhere to the national regulations that govern their activities, but they can also try to do better where in an aspirational way where they can. And there's always going to be bad actors out there, but my experience in working with the operators and industry is that by and large, we want to do the right thing. We want to have sustainable space. It's a good business case and sense to do that. And it's especially important in this era of new large constellations. So I'm seeing
self-preservation.
That's right. That's right. You're preserving your environment and your funding stream, if you will. Again, it makes good business sense. So in advance of treaties and other normative content that may be developed over the next 20 years, for example, I and a lot of the operators feel that we can do something now to try and make things as good as we can. So this is an example of that. Space operators and relevant industry stakeholders can assemble best practice for long-term sustainability of space operations. The Space Safety Coalition is just being formed this year. That's an ad hoc coalition formed to assemble operational best practices for long-term sustainability of space activities. It is not a legal entity, if you will. It's just operators and industry stakeholders getting together to try and do the right thing and look at long-term sustainability. So what we've got in this new Space Safety Coalition is a number of operators and companies that have come up with best practices addressing all phases of spacecraft life, all orbit regimes and mission types, communications and Earth observing, et cetera, and all form factors, not just small sats, not just large constellations, not just huge geosynchronous spacecraft. So this is pretty exciting because we have a document which is finally looking kind of at all the pieces. And while this document is non-normative, so there's no legally binding content, the signatories do endorse and agree to strive to implement what's in the document. So in the current best practices document that's been assembled for the coalition, we have two parts to it. Part one looks for adherence to the current international best practices and standards. That includes the IDC guidelines, which have been published and are maintained by the IDC, the UN Copious Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines, the ISO family of space debris mitigation standards, and also CCSDS, the data exchange standards. So that's part one. And just having a document where operators and industry recognize that those exist and they have a lot of merit is a great thing. But we went further within that. And I'm not going to go through all the wording here, but I think the key point is to say that over and above those consensus international standards, this document has about 40 to 42 specific aspirational standards to overlay. And that's a lot of content. So when you put that all together, I think you have a good, again, aspirational document. So we've gone through all these groups now. Now we're finally
getting... Is that document available for everyone to look at? And
yeah,
have
actually.
A link to that?
Yeah, it's spacesafety.org. And folks can see it on the web. We welcome operators to join, and not just operators, but industry. It can be government entities. It's very open arms. So please have a look at that and contact me if you're interested in participating and hopefully endorsing. So now we're going to talk about national policy and regulatory governance. The common reasons for this is to fulfill the obligations of the treaties from the UN Copious. So when countries sign on to that, that's all great, but they need to then, within their country, put up regulations that adhere to the treaties they've signed. They also want consistency. So if you have regulations that say, hey, you have to do this, then everybody can adhere to that. There are new space policy directives at the U.S. level, which have broad changes in them. And this is just in the last couple of years. You can go to the web and find these easily by a search on U.S. space policy directives. These have a lot of wide-ranging impact on where we may be headed with space governance within our country. So I think that's pretty exciting. There are some areas that still have to be addressed and aren't being maybe currently addressed by our existing national regulations, whereas there are some like the FCC regulations, which are meeting some of the policy directive edicts. So the FCC has orbital debris mitigation rules. This is the Federal Communications Commission. And I show over on the right here kind of some of the text from their website. And and their various parts. This is part 25 when someone applies for a satellite license. There's different mechanisms you can use to do your application. And basically, the applicants must describe to the FCC's satisfaction how they're going to mitigate debris. That's one of the tenets in there. The interesting thing to me, or one little interesting thing, is who ensures that the operators actually follow what they said they were going to do in the application. And the future plan for space traffic management could have a role to do some of that monitoring, if you will. Large constellations are coming along. There's a brand new study from NASA Orbital Debris Program Office, which looked at the evolution of debris. There's some tabular form here looking at various scenarios, and down on the bottom you can see the anticipated evolution of the space population, and kind of up is over the years, up is a bad thing. So we would like to try and keep the growth of space debris as flat as possible, of course. So next, let's discuss some of the vehicles for implementing national regulations within the U.S. We have the Federal Communications Commission and their rules for when you apply for a license for spacecraft or constellations. It includes some orbital debris mitigation content, and basically the applicant has to share with the FCC how they're going to be compliant and avoid creating debris. So that's very good. The recognition from some of the recent large constellation applications, though, is that the rules that are in place really need some work. The whole new space era is unfolding, and it's going to place new demands on things, not just in the space environment, but the application process at FCC and the potentially the lag time in getting approvals for these new exciting constellations. So there is a recognition that the regulatory framework at the FCC needs to be updated and perhaps develop some comprehensive policies to mitigate collision risk. In that line, the FCC has fairly recently issued a notice of proposed rulemaking and solicited industry inputs to those proposed rules. And they're fairly widespread, fairly comprehensive rules that they're proposing. And the comment period for this, the latest proposed rulemaking ended in April, and I think FCC is evaluating this. But just to kind of give you a flavor for what they're looking at introducing a streamlined process to applications for satellites.
They're going to need to with that number of satellites.
Yeah, but they're trying to limit this especially to small constellations and objects that are smaller. So I list some of the satellite and fleet preconditions on the chart here. It has to be less than 10 satellites, satellite mass less than 180 kilograms, et cetera. And then there are also safety of flight and debris mitigation requirements here. Disposed by atmospheric reentry, orbit lifetime less than 5 years, which is much more constraining than 25-year international guideline. So there are preconditions on this, but the exciting thing is if your case matches the space safety and fleet and spacecraft and now RF conditions, you can get perhaps a much cheaper, faster application through more quickly, and still in a responsible way. So that's exciting. There's also licensing required through the Department of Commerce if you are using remote sensing, and I list some of that up here. The DOC is also looking at changing their rules with a notice of proposed rulemaking and kind of do the same thing of some preconditions like the FCC was looking at. And there's a link here at the bottom of the page where people can go to get more information on that. Here are some of the standard conditions they would look to do in their requirements. There are categories in the Department of Commerce, which is NOAA, remote sensing applications. And if you are considered low risk, then you can get things through perhaps faster if you meet the requirements here. So to summarize, we've looked through now kind of the whole topology of space governance. We started with the spacecraft operators, which can be comprised of academia and commercial and governments and industry. We've gone to the international level where we have the IDC, we have the UN, United Nations, we have the International Telecommunications Union. We've gone to the space standards level at the international level. We've looked at commercial industry associations. And then finally, we've looked at national regulatory areas. And this is our whole fabric of space governance here. And I want to be clear once again, the fact that we started with the operators doesn't really mean anything. All these entities are, interplaying with each other on space governance, and it is a virtuous cycle. I welcome questions. If you have comments or questions about this, please contact us. We'd love to talk to you.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Dan. And yeah, like Dan said, if you have any questions, you can find out more at agi.com. You can email us, info@agi.com, and we can make sure the questions get to Dan. And your Space Safety Coalition website again, can you?
Yeah,
plug that
that's
one more time?
spacesafety.org. We'd love to have you take a look at that. The, again, aspirational best practices we put together, but we feel this is a very complementary set of best practices to merge with the international standards and guidelines that are out there.
Great.
Thank
All
you
right.
very much for your time.
Thanks for coming on.
Yep,
Thanks.
see ya.
See you later.